100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
When I was reading to prepare for this interview, I was quite surprised to see you use the word Aborigines talking about African Americans.
I'm Anderson Cooper in Cape Coast, Ghana, and this is a special edition of 360, President Obama's African Journey. We're coming to you from Cape Coast Castle, one of several fortresses along the West African coast through which an estimated 10 to 40 million enslaved Africans were shipped off to the New World, many of those, of course, ending up in America. The president came here as part of a presidential trip, his first presidential trip to sub-Saharan Africa. But it's also a trip that is in many ways deeply personal for President Obama.
You know, the spirit, particularly of a place like Ghana, where, you know, for all the difficulties it's still going through, the people are just incredibly open and friendly and welcoming. I think that makes a difference for a lot of people who, you know, maybe African Americans who feel somehow that they never fully belong. And the only thing I would say, though, is there's a flip side to this, which is I know an awful lot of African Americans who come to Africa, are profoundly moved, but also realize how American they are when they're here, and you know, recognize that they could never live here. You know, and that's part of the African American experience. You are, in some ways, you know, connected to this distant land, but on the other end, you're about as American as it gets. In some ways, African Americans are more fundamentally rooted in the American experience because they don't have a recent immigrant experience to draw on. It's that unique African American culture that has existed in North America for hundreds of years, long before we actually founded the nation.
One of the extraordinary facts of investigative pursuits is that historical research has become a significant part of it for the first time. The attempts in the last 10, 15, 20 years to revisit areas which it was conveniently thought had been solved, that all questions had been answered, is now open to serious questioning. I made some notes just quickly before I came about the subjects that people have begun to look at in earnest and have done for the last while. And I say that as a way of introducing this really interesting and excellent book that opens exactly this area up for inspection. This substratum of investigative stuff really attempts to puncture illusions and fraudulent interpretations of history. The first that I came across immediately was Paul Foote. Many of you will know who he was. He was probably the largest award for investigative journalism in Britain is done in his name. And he spent a large part of his life, besides investigating all sorts of crimes and social injustices in Britain, investigating what happened to Shelley's political poetry. And he wrote an excellent book called Red Shelley, which was precisely an elegant and descriptive analysis of why his most potent and virulent material was never published. It was, in fact, it was ignored for 80 years. He spent a lot of time looking at a curious military defeat when a huge British detachment, military detachment, set sail for Dominica to fight the black general Toussaint Louverture. And were sadly defeated in 10 days. But tonight, this is much more interesting. Mountain. And having said all of that, I'd like to introduce them so they can tell you about this extraordinary book. Go ahead.
Well, this book began not as a book, but began as a TV documentary. This is what we thought. Its origins are Australia. I was in Australia on holiday. My wife is Australian, and I was in that wonderful institution, the Mitchell Library in Sydney. And I came across there, understandably, the Australians are kind of interested in convicts and transportation, and they have a vast collection on convicts and transportation. And I came across an astonishing book. It was very old, very obscure, and it amazed me. It told of how women were in the 18th and 17th centuries were, and children too, were shipped and sold in America. And I'd never heard of this. I'd never heard of the details. And while this only told a bit of the story, it disturbed me and encouraged me and horrified me. So I thought, great story here. And Don and I had been talking about how do we sell a story about the abolition of slavery. We've been talking about it, and we hadn't come up with anything. I came back to England with the photocopy of this book, and he will tell you what happened then.
Well, I suppose that I'm Laurel to Mike's Hardy, in that it was another fine mess he got me into. In that I read the photocopies of what he had brought back, and what he brought back was photocopies of a book written by a man called Abbott Emerson Smith, who had written about how women, mainly prostitutes, but all sorts of other people as well, who were taken out of the Bridewell prison in London in the early 1600s and sent off to the new colonies in America as brides for the planters, if you like. So these were women of marriageable age or of breeding age or whatever, who would be sent off, because up until then, of course, you had a brand new colony, it was all men, and for this to become viable, they needed women. And this seemed to be an astonishing thing, and so it went from there, and one looked at this and thought, well, this is just the tip of something. This is actually the edge of something here. And so the very fact that these women were taken out of the penal system in Britain, in England, and sent off to the new colonies, with no say for themselves about whether or not they went or not. So the interesting thing was, what was it they were going into? What was it was already there that these people could just be taken out and shipped 3,000 miles away? And so we started to look at what this possibly could mean and what the wider context was of that. And that's how it began.
And we unearthed a wider and wider story. We found it wasn't just women, it was children, it was convicts, it was prisoners of war, it was all sorts. It was also people who signed up as indentured servants to get to America free of, they didn't have to pay the passage, the poor. They would be contracted, indentured by merchants and by captains and by planters' agents to go to America free, in return for which they gave up their rights to their labour for several years. It was supposed to be, according to history, it's 4 or 5 years. In fact, it could be as many as 12. And what they didn't realise was that they were signing away all their rights, and they had become chattels. They were used as property, regarded as property. Now, as we began to investigate this, and we used all the kind of resources that investigators do, we look at every kind of book, every kind of official report, etc., diaries, letters, we realised it was an enormous story. And it was also something which refuted one of the great ideas, well, one of the key ideas of the development of slavery, which is that in 1619 slavery began in America with the arrival of 20 and odd Negroes, as they were called, sold, according to accounts, by a Dutch captain to planters in England, and this was where slavery began. Well, it wasn't true. Slavery had begun earlier. Children and women and convicts had been sold earlier than that, and although a small number of Africans were subsequently brought to Virginia and sold over the next decades, only very few, only 350 years later. Oh, sorry, 20 years later. But meantime, hundreds, thousands of poor whites were being brought in, and on various convicts and children, etc., and they were being enslaved. So that started us thinking this is an enormous story. It was a story too big, in fact, to sell to television. There were so many aspects of it, we didn't know how to compact it, but we did think it was an important and terrific book.
Yeah. And then the question was, if we were right on what was going on, the question in your mind immediately is, as a journalist, is, well, why doesn't everybody know this already?